Moving to Willow Heights felt like stepping into a dream. The houses were beautiful, the streets clean, and the lawns looked like they belonged in a magazine. It was everything my wife, Sarah, and I had hoped for, a peaceful place where we could settle down and enjoy life. But dreams have a way of turning into something else when reality sets in. And trust me, reality came knocking sooner than we expected. Sarah is not your average person. She's the county sheriff, which means she spends her days keeping people safe and enforcing laws. You'd think that title alone would command respect, but apparently, not everyone got the memo. In Willow Heights, there were other kinds of rules that mattered more. Rules set by the Homeowners Association, or HOA. These weren't just simple guidelines about trash day or parking. These were strict, detailed regulations that controlled almost every aspect of how you live your life here. The HOA had rules about everything. What color your house could be, how tall your grass could grow, even what kind of curtains you could hang in your windows. At first, it seemed harmless enough. Sure, it was a little over the top. But hey, if it kept the neighborhood looking nice, why complain? That's what I thought until things took a strange turn. One Saturday morning, Sarah came home after finishing her night shift as sheriff. She was tired but determined to tackle some yard work she'd been meaning to do. Our hedges along the driveway were getting out of hand. They looked wild, like something from a haunted house movie. So, armed with hedge clippers, Sarah headed outside to fix them. I stayed inside, sipping coffee and enjoying the quiet morning. That peace didn't last long. About 10 minutes later, I heard voices coming from the front yard. Curious, I peeked out the window and saw a man standing across the street, staring at our hedges. He wore mirrored sunglasses, khaki pants, and a polo shirt with Willow Heights Community Enforcement Officer stitched on the pocket. His white truck was parked nearby, and he carried a clipboard like he meant business. "Ma'am," he called out, his voice loud and authoritative. "You're violating Section 8.3 of the HOA guidelines. Those hedges exceed the maximum height allowed." I watched as Sarah stopped trimming and turned to face him. Her expression was unreadable, but I knew that look. It meant trouble. "This is your property line?" the man asked, pointing at our hedges as if they were criminals. "Yes," Sarah replied calmly, setting the clippers down. "And who exactly are you?" "I'm Deputy Director of Compliance for Willow Heights," he said, puffing out his chest. His tone made it clear he expected her to be impressed, or maybe intimidated. Sarah crossed her arms. "Deputy Director of what now?" "Compliance," he repeated, clearly annoyed. "Look, ma'am, these hedges need to be trimmed immediately. Failure to comply will result in fines, and possibly legal action." By this point, I stepped outside to see what was going on. When I saw the guy acting like he owned the place, I almost laughed. Almost. Something about him rubbed me the wrong way. Maybe it was the way he talked down to Sarah, or maybe it was the ridiculousness of arguing over bushes. Either way, I knew this wasn't going to end well. Sarah didn't back down. Instead, she leaned closer, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Listen, buddy, I'm trimming them right now. So unless you want to stand there and supervise, maybe take your clipboard elsewhere." The man adjusted his sunglasses, trying to look tough. "Ma'am, I don't think you understand how serious this is. These rules exist for a reason." "Oh, trust me, I understand fine," Sarah shot back. "What I don't understand is why you're acting like you're the king of this subdivision." That's when things took an unexpected turn. The man reached into his belt holster and pulled out a gun. Yes, a gun. Time seemed to stop. My heart raced as I processed what was happening. Was this really happening? Over hedges? But Sarah didn't flinch. Not one bit. The moment the man pulled out the gun, my mind went blank. My hands shot up instinctively, even though I wasn't the one he was pointing it at. Fear gripped me like a vice. How had this escalated so quickly? All Sarah had done was trim some overgrown hedges. Was this really worth pulling a weapon over? But Sarah, bless her heart, didn't react the way most people would. Instead of panicking or backing down, she stood her ground. She tilted her head slightly, her expression calm but sharp, like a teacher addressing a student who'd just given a wrong answer. "Is that supposed to intimidate me?" she asked, her tone steady and almost amused. There was no trace of fear in her voice, only quiet confidence. It was surreal, watching her handle the situation with such composure while I stood frozen, trying to make sense of what was happening. The man adjusted his grip on the gun, clearly trying to maintain control of the situation. "Ma'am," he said, his voice firmer now, "I'm authorized to enforce these regulations however necessary." Sarah didn't blink. She reached into her back pocket and pulled out her badge, the shiny, official-looking badge that marked her as the county sheriff. Holding it up for him to see, she took a step closer, closing the gap between them. "You might want to rethink pointing that thing at me," she said, her voice still calm but carrying an edge that made it clear she meant business. "Because last time I checked, impersonating a police officer is a serious offense, and threatening one with a firearm, well, let's just say that's going to land you in a lot of trouble." For a split second, the man froze. His bravado crumbled, and his face turned pale. He glanced at her badge, then back at her face, as if trying to process whether she was bluffing. But Sarah's demeanor left no room for doubt. She wasn't someone to mess with. "What's your name?" she asked, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. He hesitated, fumbling for words. Finally, he stammered, Greg. Greg Thompson." "Well, Greg," Sarah continued, stepping even closer now, "you've got two options here. Option 1. You leave my property right now, apologize for being a colossal idiot, and never come back. Option 2. I arrest your ass for brandishing a weapon and impersonating an officer. Your call." Greg's hand trembled slightly as he lowered the gun. For a moment, he just stood there, looking like a kid caught stealing cookies from the jar. Then, without another word, he turned around and practically sprinted back to his truck. The engine roared to life, and he sped off, leaving behind a cloud of dust and disbelief. As soon as he was gone, Sarah burst out laughing. Not a nervous laugh, but a full-on, belly-shaking laugh. I stared at her, still shaken, unable to believe what had just happened. "Did that really just happen?" I finally managed to ask, my voice trembling. "Oh yeah," she said, grinning. "Welcome to Willow Heights, honey, where the HOA thinks they're running a police state." We both laughed, but deep down, I knew this wasn't over. This wasn't just about Greg. It was about the toxic culture of control that had taken root in our neighborhood. And if Sarah had anything to say about it, it was going to change. Later that day, as we sat on the porch sipping coffee, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. The absurdity of it all hit me again and again. A grown man had pulled a gun over hedges. Hedges. It was ridiculous, but also infuriating. Who gave him the authority to act like that? What kind of place were we living in where someone thought it was okay to escalate a minor issue into a potentially dangerous confrontation? Sarah seemed less bothered by it than I was. She leaned back in her chair, sipping her coffee like nothing unusual had happened. "You know," she said after a while, "this isn't the first time I've seen something like this. People get a little power, and suddenly they think they're untouchable." I nodded, though I wasn't entirely convinced. Sure, I'd heard stories about strict HOAs, but this felt different. This wasn't just about rules. It was about intimidation. About making people feel small and powerless. And the worst part, they probably got away with it most of the time because people were too afraid to fight back. But not Sarah. Never Sarah. She set her mug down and looked at me, her expression thoughtful. "We can't let this slide," she said firmly. "If we do, it'll just keep happening. To us, to our neighbors, to anyone who doesn't fall in line. We need to hold them accountable." I agreed, though I wasn't sure where to start. Taking on the HOA sounded like a daunting task, especially when they had people like Greg patrolling the streets. But Sarah had a fire in her eyes that told me she wasn't going to back down. Not this time. By the end of the day, Sarah had already drafted a formal complaint to the county sheriff's department, requesting an investigation into Greg's actions. She also sent an email to the HOA board, demanding answers about their hiring practices and oversight. It was the beginning of what promised to be a long and difficult battle, but one we were ready to fight. As night fell, I found myself feeling strangely hopeful. Maybe moving to Willow Heights hadn't been such a mistake after all. Not because of the neighborhood itself, but because it had brought us face to face with something worth fighting for. Something bigger than hedges or rules or guns. It had reminded us that standing up for what's right, even when it's hard, is always worth it. The next morning, the neighborhood buzzed with whispers. Somehow, word had gotten out about what happened between Sarah and Greg. It spread faster than wildfire, probably because Willow Heights was the kind of place where everyone noticed everything. By the time I stepped outside to grab the newspaper, a few neighbors were already gathered on their porches, talking in hushed tones. Some glanced our way, clearly curious but unsure how to approach us. At first, I thought people might side with Greg. After all, he worked for the HOA, and the HOA ran this neighborhood like its own little kingdom. But as the day went on, something surprising happened. People started reaching out to us, not to criticize or judge, but to share their own stories of frustration and fear. One neighbor, an older woman named Mrs. Dawson, stopped by in the afternoon. She carried a plate of cookies, which she handed to Sarah with a nervous smile. "I heard about what happened yesterday," she said softly. "That man, he's been giving everyone trouble. Last month, he fined me $200 because my mailbox wasn't painted the approved shade of gray." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Seriously, over a mailbox?" Mrs. Dawson nodded. "He said it was distracting. Can you believe that? I've lived here for 15 years, and suddenly my mailbox is a crime." Another neighbor, a young dad named Tom, chimed in from across the street. "He threatened to tow my car once because I parked it in my driveway overnight." My driveway? Like, where else am I supposed to park? As more people joined the conversation, it became clear that Greg wasn't just targeting us. He'd been bullying the entire neighborhood for months. Fines, threats, inspections at odd hours. It was all part of his routine, and no one had dared to speak up before now. Sarah listened intently, her expression growing darker with each story. When the group finally dispersed, she turned to me, her jaw set in determination. "This isn't just about us anymore," she said. "It's about holding them accountable, for Greg, for the HOA, for everything." That evening, Sarah sat at the kitchen table surrounded by papers. She had printed copies of the HOA guidelines, along with notes from her conversations with neighbors. Her laptop was open, displaying emails she'd sent to local authorities and screenshots of text messages from residents who wanted to help. It was like watching her solve a case, except this time, the stakes felt personal. "Here's the thing," she said, tapping her pen against the table. "Greg didn't act alone. Someone hired him, trained him, or at least let him think he could behave like that. The HOA board has to answer for this." I nodded, though I couldn't shake the feeling that taking on the HOA would be harder than we imagined. These were people who thrived on control, who prided themselves on maintaining order, even if that order came at the expense of kindness or common sense. Going up against them wouldn't be easy. But Sarah wasn't one to back down. She spent hours drafting a letter to the HOA board, outlining exactly what had happened with Greg and demanding answers. She included photos of his truck parked menacingly outside homes, screenshots of fine notices sent to neighbors, and detailed accounts of his behavior. She made sure every word was professional, factual, and impossible to ignore. By the time she finished, it was late at night. I watched as she hit send, her fingers hovering over the keyboard for a moment before pulling away. "Let's see how they respond," she said, standing up and stretching. "If they don't take this seriously, we'll escalate." The response came quicker than we expected. Early the next morning, there was a knock at the door. Standing on our porch was Mrs. Peterson, the president of the HOA board. She looked flustered, clutching a folder tightly in her hands. Behind her stood two other board members, both looking equally uncomfortable. "Can we come in?" Mrs. Peterson asked, her voice strained. Sarah crossed her arms. "Depends. Are you here to apologize?" Mrs. Peterson hesitated, glancing at her colleagues. "We're here to discuss the incident involving Mr. Thompson." "Incident?" Sarah repeated, raising an eyebrow. "You mean when he pulled a gun on me?" The board members shifted uncomfortably. One of them cleared his throat. "Look, we understand this situation has caused concern. We're reviewing Mr. Thompson's conduct and will ensure appropriate action is taken." "Appropriate action?" Sarah echoed, her tone sharp. "Like firing him, or maybe pressing charges, because threatening someone with a weapon is a felony." Mrs. Peterson winced. "We're handling it internally." Sarah shook her head. "That's not good enough. This isn't just about Greg. It's about the culture you've created here. A culture where people feel powerless and afraid to speak up." The board members exchanged uneasy glances. They hadn't anticipated Sarah's resolve, or her refusal to accept vague promises. For the first time, they seemed genuinely rattled. "We'll look into it further," Mrs. Peterson said quickly. "But please, give us some time." Sarah stepped closer, her voice firm. "You've got 1 week. If nothing changes by then, I'm going public. Trust me, you don't want that." As the board members walked away, I turned to Sarah, impressed. "Do you really think they'll do anything?" She smirked. "Oh, they will. Because if they don't, I'll make sure everyone knows exactly how this so-called community operates." For the first time since moving to Willow Heights, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this neighborhood wasn't beyond saving after all. The week that followed felt like a ticking time bomb. The HOA board had promised to look into Greg's behavior, but Sarah wasn't about to sit back and wait for them to sweep things under the rug. She knew better than anyone how organizations like this worked. They'd stall, deflect, or try to bury the issue until everyone forgot about it. But Sarah wasn't going to let that happen. She spent the next few days rallying the neighbors. Armed with her badge, her determination, and a growing stack of evidence, she went door to door, talking to people who'd been affected by Greg's antics. Some were hesitant at first, worried about retaliation from the HOA. But Sarah's calm confidence put them at ease. By the end of the week, she had a list of over a dozen residents willing to testify about Greg's bullying tactics. Everything from excessive fines to verbal intimidation. One neighbor, a single mom named Lisa, told us how Greg had shown up unannounced late at night because her porch light was burned out. He said if I didn't fix it within 24 hours, he'd report me to the board, she explained, shaking her head. It sounds silly now, but at the time, I was terrified. I didn't know what they'd do. Another man, Mr. Alvarez, recounted how Greg had inspected his backyard during a family barbecue, claiming his grill was too close to the fence. He acted like he owned the place, Mr. Alvarez said bitterly. Like we're all just tenants living in their perfect little world. As the stories piled up, Sarah began organizing a plan. She suggested holding a neighborhood meeting, not just to air grievances, but to demand real change. "We can't let them push us around anymore," she told the group one evening. "If we stand together, they won't be able to ignore us." The idea of a meeting excited some people, but others were nervous. What if they retaliate? One woman asked during a planning session at our house. "They could fine us, or worse, kick us out." "They can try," Sarah replied firmly. "But trust me, no court is going to side with them if they start punishing people for speaking up. Besides, we're not doing anything wrong. We're asking for fairness and accountability. That's not unreasonable." Her words seemed to reassure the group, and slowly support grew. Flyers went up around the neighborhood, urging residents to attend the meeting. Social media posts spread the word even further. By the time the day arrived, the community center was packed with people eager to voice their frustrations. When the HOA board walked in, they looked visibly uncomfortable. Mrs. Peterson, the president, tried to maintain her usual air of authority, but it faltered as she scanned the room. Every chair was filled, and more people stood along the walls, craning their necks to see what would happen next. "Thank you all for coming," Mrs. Peterson began, clutching her notes tightly. "We're here to address recent concerns regarding—" "Cut the crap," Sarah interrupted, standing up. The room fell silent. Even the board members stopped fidgeting and turned to look at her. "We're here because one of your so-called enforcement officers pulled a gun on me while I was trimming my hedges. And guess what? I'm the sheriff." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Neighbors exchanged shocked glances, while the board members exchanged uneasy looks. Clearly, they hadn't expected Sarah to call them out so directly or so publicly. She held up her badge for everyone to see. "Let's get one thing straight. Greg Thompson isn't just incompetent. He's dangerous. He impersonated a police officer, brandished a weapon, and intimidated innocent people. That's not enforcement. That's criminal behavior, and it happened because you gave him power without oversight." Mrs. Peterson sputtered, clearly caught off guard. We weren't aware of the extent of his actions. That's the problem." Sarah shot back. "You didn't care enough to check. You let him run wild because it suited your agenda, to control every little detail of our lives. Well, guess what? People are tired of it." One by one, other neighbors stood up to share their stories. Lisa talked about the burned-out porch light. Mr. Alvarez described the surprise inspection during his barbecue. Others chimed in with tales of unfair fines, unnecessary rules, and outright harassment. Each story added fuel to the fire, turning the room into a chorus of voices demanding change. By the time the last person spoke, the energy in the room was electric. The board members sat frozen, their faces pale. They had underestimated the power of unity and the determination of a sheriff who refused to back down. Sarah wrapped up the meeting with a simple statement. "This isn't just about Greg. It's about creating a neighborhood where people feel safe, respected, and free to live their lives without fear. If you won't fix this, we will. Together." As the crowd dispersed, I noticed something remarkable. For the first time since moving to Willow Heights, people smiled at each other. Not polite smiles, but genuine ones. For once, it felt like we weren't just neighbors. We were allies. And that made all the difference. The days after the meeting were a whirlwind of activity. The HOA board, clearly shaken by the public outcry, scrambled to respond. They issued a formal apology via email to all residents, promising an internal review of Greg's actions and assuring everyone that such incidents wouldn't happen again. But Sarah wasn't satisfied with empty promises. She knew how these things worked. Apologies were cheap, but accountability was rare. "They're stalling," she said one evening as we sat on the porch, watching the sunset. "They think if they throw us some vague reassurances, we'll just go back to our lives and forget about it." "Well, are we going to let them?" I asked, knowing full well what her answer would be. She smirked. "Not a chance." Sarah decided to take things up a notch. She filed a formal complaint with the county sheriff's department, not just about Greg, but about the HOA's lack of oversight. She included copies of the testimonies from neighbors, screenshots of threatening messages Greg had sent, and even photos of his truck parked menacingly outside homes. It was a mountain of evidence that painted a clear picture. Greg wasn't just a rogue enforcer. He was a symptom of a much bigger problem. But Sarah didn't stop there. She reached out to local news outlets, sharing the story of what had happened in Willow Heights. At first, I was nervous. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" I asked. "What if people think we're making too big a deal out of it?" Sarah shook her head. "It is a big deal. This isn't just about us. It's about standing up for what's right. If shining a light on their behavior helps other neighborhoods avoid the same mess, then it's worth it." Her confidence was contagious. By the time the first news article appeared online, titled "Sheriff Takes on Overzealous HOA Cop," The story had gone viral. Reporters called nonstop, eager to hear more about the showdown between Sarah and Greg. Neighbors who had once been hesitant to speak out now felt emboldened, sharing their own experiences with journalists. Willow Heights was suddenly in the spotlight, and not in a good way. Meanwhile, the HOA board was in full damage control mode. Mrs. Peterson called an emergency meeting, inviting key residents, including Sarah, to discuss next steps. When we arrived at the community center, the atmosphere was tense. The board members looked like deer caught in headlights, surrounded by reporters snapping photos and neighbors demanding answers. Mrs. Peterson tried to take charge, her voice trembling slightly. "We understand the gravity of the situation and are committed to ensuring this never happens again. Effective immediately, Mr. Thompson has been terminated from his position." A murmur rippled through the crowd. While some seemed satisfied, others weren't ready to let the board off the hook so easily. "What about the rest of your policies?" someone shouted from the back. "Are you going to keep treating us like prisoners in our own homes?" Another neighbor chimed in. "Yeah. What about the fines, the inspections, the constant nitpicking over every little thing?" Sarah stepped forward, silencing the room with her presence. "This isn't just about firing Greg," she said firmly. "It's about changing the culture here. You've spent years micromanaging people's lives, enforcing rules that have nothing to do with safety or property values. It's time to rethink how you operate." The board members exchanged uneasy glances. One of them, a man named Mr. Harris, spoke up hesitantly. We hear you, and we're willing to make changes, but it won't happen overnight." "It better start happening soon," Sarah replied, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Because if it doesn't, we'll take this fight beyond Willow Heights. Trust me, you don't want that kind of attention." In the weeks that followed, real change began to take root. The HOA implemented new policies, including mandatory background checks for any future staff and clearer guidelines for enforcement procedures. Monthly meetings replaced secretive board sessions, giving residents a voice in decision-making. Slowly but surely, the toxic culture of control started to fade. Sarah became something of a local hero. People joked about how the HOA had picked the wrong person to mess with, and kids started calling her Sheriff Hedgeclipper. She took it all in stride, though I could tell she was proud of what we accomplished. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Sarah turned to me with a satisfied smile. "You know," she said, "maybe this place isn't so bad after all." I laughed. "Yeah, but next time, let's skip the drama and just move somewhere without an HOA." She grinned. "Deal." And just like that, Willow Heights transformed, not because of rules or regulations, but because of courage, unity, and a sheriff who refused to put up with anyone's nonsense. As the dust began to settle in Willow Heights, the changes brought about by Sarah's relentless push for accountability started to take shape. The HOA board, once untouchable and intimidating, now seemed almost human. They held regular meetings that were open to all residents, not just a select few. People could voice their concerns without fear of being fined or ignored. It was a far cry from the rigid, secretive system they'd operated under before. But Sarah didn't stop there. She knew that real change required more than just new policies. It needed trust. And trust wasn't something you could enforce with rules. It had to be earned. So she worked tirelessly to rebuild connections within the neighborhood. She organized community events, potlucks, movie nights, even a block-wide yard sale where proceeds went to a local charity. Slowly but surely, the icy walls between neighbors began to melt away. One Saturday morning, I woke up to find Sarah already outside, setting up chairs and tables in our driveway. "What's all this for?" I asked, yawning as I stepped onto the porch. "It's coffee with your neighbor's day," she said, grinning. "I figured it's time we got to know each other better. No agendas, no complaints, just coffee and conversation." By mid-morning, our front yard was bustling with activity. Neighbors who had barely exchanged hellos in years were laughing together over cups of coffee and plates of homemade cookies. Mrs. Dawson brought her famous banana bread, while Tom set up a mini lemonade stand for the kids. Even Mr. Alvarez, who usually kept to himself, joined in, sharing stories about his days as a high school teacher. For the first time since moving to Willow Heights, it felt like we were part of a real community, not just a collection of houses bound by rules. People lingered long after the coffee ran out, reluctant to leave the warmth of connection they'd rediscovered. Sarah stood off to the side, watching it all unfold with a satisfied smile. "This is what it's supposed to feel like," she said quietly when I joined her. "Not perfect, but real." Of course, not everyone was happy about the changes. A small group of longtime residents, the ones who had always clung tightly to the old ways, grumbled about how things were falling apart. They missed the strict enforcement, the pristine orderliness, the illusion of control. But their voices grew quieter as more people embraced the new spirit of the neighborhood. Even Mrs. Peterson, the former HOA president, seemed to soften over time. One afternoon, she stopped by our house unexpectedly, carrying a casserole dish wrapped in foil. "I wanted to thank you," she said awkwardly, handing it to Sarah. "You've made us see things differently. We were so focused on rules that we forgot about people." Sarah accepted the dish with a nod, though I could tell she was surprised. "It's not about me," she replied. "It's about all of us working together." Mrs. Peterson hesitated, then added, "And I'm sorry for everything. We let things get out of hand, and it nearly cost us everything that makes this place special." Sarah smiled faintly. "Apology accepted. Just don't let it happen again." As the months passed, Willow Heights continued to evolve. The hedges along our driveway stayed trimmed, mostly because Sarah insisted, but nobody complained about them anymore. Kids played freely in the streets, bikes lined driveways, and laughter echoed through the air. It wasn't perfect. There were still disagreements, misunderstandings, and the occasional squabble over parking, but it felt alive in a way it never had before. Sarah became a symbol of hope for many. Her badge carried weight, yes, but it was her determination and compassion that truly inspired people. When a young family down the street struggled to pay their HOA dues due to medical bills, neighbors rallied to help. When an elderly couple needed repairs on their roof, volunteers showed up with tools and supplies. Willow Heights was becoming more than just a place to live. It was becoming a home. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching fireflies dance in the twilight, I turned to Sarah. "Do you think Greg learned anything from all this?" She shrugged. "Maybe. Maybe not. But that's not really the point. The point is, we did. We stood up, we spoke out, and we changed things. For ourselves and for each other." I nodded, feeling a deep sense of pride, not just in Sarah, but in the entire neighborhood. We'd faced fear, intimidation, and division, and somehow we'd come out stronger on the other side. "Hey," I said, nudging her playfully. "Think the HOA will ever try to fine us for having too many fireflies?" Sarah laughed, leaning back in her chair. "If they do, I'll arrest them myself." And for the first time in a long time, I believed her. Months later, Willow Heights was almost unrecognizable from the neighborhood we'd moved into. The once stifling grip of the HOA had loosened, replaced by a sense of freedom and camaraderie that made it feel like a true community. People waved to each other as they walked their dogs. Kids played tag in the cul-de-sacs until sunset. Neighbors shared recipes, tools, and stories over backyard fences. It wasn't perfect. No place ever is. But it was alive in a way it hadn't been before. Sarah's role in this transformation didn't go unnoticed. She became something of a legend around town, not just for standing up to Greg, but for reminding everyone what it meant to fight for fairness and kindness. At first, people joked about her title as Sheriff Hedge-Clipper, but soon it stuck. Kids drew pictures of her with a badge and hedge clippers, and one neighbor even made a custom sign for our front yard. "Protected by Sheriff Hedge-Clipper." Sarah rolled her eyes at the nickname, but secretly loved it. One crisp autumn morning, I woke up to find her sitting on the porch, sipping coffee and flipping through a photo album she pulled from the attic. "What's that?" I asked, joining her with my own mug. "Just looking back," she said, smiling as she turned the pages. There were pictures of our early days in Willow Heights, the stiff smiles during HOA meetings, the chaotic moments when Greg showed up, and finally, the triumphant scenes of neighbors coming together. Hard to believe how far we've come. I nodded. "Yeah. Remember when we thought this place might drive us crazy?" She laughed. "Oh, it did, for a while. But sometimes you have to hit rock bottom to realize what really matters." That afternoon, the neighborhood gathered for its annual fall festival, a tradition that had been revived thanks to Sarah's efforts. The park was alive with laughter and music. Booths lined the pathways, offering homemade pies, pumpkin carving contests, and face painting for the kids. Someone had even set up a dunk tank, which quickly became the highlight of the event. When Sarah climbed onto the platform, the crowd erupted into cheers. "All right, who wants to take a shot?" she called out, grinning as she sat on the edge of the seat. One by one, neighbors stepped up, paying $1 for 3 throws. Even Mrs. Peterson joined in, laughing as she missed every attempt. When it was my turn, I aimed carefully, feeling the weight of the ball in my hand. "You ready for this?" I teased. "Bring it on," Sarah replied, crossing her arms confidently. The moment the ball hit the target, sending her plunging into the water below, the crowd roared. She surfaced with a laugh, shaking droplets from her hair. Okay, I deserve that." As the day wound down, we all gathered around a bonfire, roasting marshmallows and swapping stories. Someone brought up the infamous hedge clipping incident, and soon everyone was laughing about it. Even Mr. Alvarez chimed in, joking that he still kept his grill exactly where Greg had told him to move it, just to spite the memory of him. Sarah leaned back in her chair, watching the flames dance. "You know," she said softly, "this whole thing taught me something important. Rules aren't bad, they help keep things running smoothly. But when rules start hurting people instead of helping them, it's time to rethink them." I nodded. "And when someone tries to enforce those rules with a gun, it's definitely time to step in." She chuckled. "Exactly." Later that night, as we walked home under a sky filled with stars, I felt a deep sense of gratitude. Not just for Sarah, but for the entire journey we'd been through. Moving to Willow Heights hadn't been easy, but it had taught us both valuable lessons about courage, resilience, and the power of standing together. "So," I said as we approached our driveway, "do you think we'll stay here for a while?" Sarah glanced at me, her expression thoughtful. "Yeah, for now anyway. It's starting to feel like home." I smiled, looking at the blue door she painted months ago, the same one that had sparked so much trouble. In the flickering light of the porch lamp, it looked cheerful, defiant, and exactly right. "Good," I said, "because I don't think I could handle another showdown with an HOA cop anytime soon." She laughed, linking her arm through mine. "Deal. But if they ever try anything, you know I've got this." And as we stepped inside, leaving the cool night air behind, I knew she was right. Willow Heights wasn't perfect, but it was ours. And thanks to Sarah, it was finally a place worth calling home.